Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 29 of Welcome to Geek Town. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. We're continuing the conversation I had with Matt Dobra last episode about the economy in the world of Star Trek. A quick warning that my online connection with Matt lost a little quality in the second half, so his voice sometimes is not quite as clear as it was, but it's still understandable, I believe. If you missed last episode, Matt's answer to the first question here sums up a lot of what he said, but if you haven't listened to it, I'd still recommend going back and doing so first, before you start in here. Now, for those of you who are all caught up, let's jump right back in. So, post-scarcity, as you've described it so far, seems to be a binary state. Either you're completely post-scarcity as a society, or you're not at all. But is it possible for there to be a middle ground? For instance, in Star Trek it seems that some materials like dilithium and latinum can't be replicated easily, so they're scarce, but at the same time, the need for those materials by most Federation citizens is little to none. So, can a society be basically post-scarcity with just a few exceptions like that?
So there's always going to be some commodities, no matter what we get to in terms of productivity, that are going to be scarce. Time and space are the key ones that I can think of. Time in that we do have a finite amount of time in which we live, and even if we somehow become infinitely lived, each day is finite in length. So time, by definition, is always going to be scarce. And space, I understand that there's a pretty much unlimited expanse of space, but there's some of it that's far more valuable and far more usable than others. So there's going to be things that we're always going to have as something that is scarce. Can we have a Star Trek type world with those few things that are still scarce? You mentioned lithium, which really is energy more than anything else. Like that's what it's used for, if I'm not mistaken. And so energy seems to be another thing in these economies that if that is scarce, then that's when the problems happen. Again, I think I mentioned earlier with regard to Voyager, they would often have a lot of rationing because their dilithium sources were low. So post-scarcity, even with some stuff that is ultimately finite in nature, like I said, it's really about, can we change how human beings perceive wants? So when I teach a principles of economics class, one of the things I do in some of the early days of class is if somebody uses the word need, I say, no, you're not allowed to use the word need. Needs don't exist, only wants exist. And that creates a lot of pushback because, of course, needs are a thing. But the way that we exist as human beings, everything that's out there that we try to consume, it ultimately is a want because we can always choose. We can always choose more of something or less of something, even if we call it a need. We call water a need, but some of us choose to consume less than others, and some of us can choose to consume more than others. If we can transform the way people view their wants as to really being able to separate needs from wants, and we can create very finite sets of needs, that is really the key to having a post-scarcity type society, even if you don't have authentic post-scarcity. Now, is that reasonable? Is that feasible? I'm skeptical.
Now, you've pretty much said that the Federation is not a true post-scarcity society. Then what is it exactly? How would you describe the economy in that world, given the definitions we have available to us?
Huh. That's a tough question. I like it. It's certainly more along the lines of a socialist economy, as far as I can tell, given that they don't have a monetary system. And as a result of that, it's really difficult to know what is profitable, what is not profitable, but you don't need to worry about that because you can replicate a whole bunch of stuff. So I would call it a universe of abundance, but not one of post-scarcity. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. It doesn't put it in a straight kind of ism, capitalism, communism, socialism, but it
has some of all of the above. So, I mean, the Federation itself still exists in a world around it where you've got, the militaristic Cardassians. Did I say Kardashians? Cardassians, right? You got the militaristic, you might view them as like the North Korea of today, although they're a lot kinder and softer than the North Koreans of today. And you've got the hyper-capitalistic Ferengi, for example. Like, they're living in a world that's surrounded by different isms. You've got the Borg, who are about as communist as you can possibly get. And what are they doing? I mean, they're doing things that I think what they're trying to do is take the best things that morally you can say exist in each of these isms, and they're trying to put them together. So they're trying to take that outward-looking man of socialism and saying, okay, we've got this, but we're also trying to take the innovation that you get from capitalism and throw that in there as well. And we're trying to get the productivity that you get, and we're going to put that in there as well. So they're trying to take all of the good things of each of the isms and lumping them together in its own special Star Trek economy.
So, as you mentioned, there are other races that aren't part of the Federation. If the Federation wants to make some sort of deal with the Ferengi, to use an example that definitely has a monetary system, is there any other sort of system other than bargaining that the two alliances, the Federation Alliance and the Ferengi Alliance, can use for trade?
I think that's a really good question. To be quite honest, I don't know what they would do if they're not trading money. I would guess that the two societies, what they're really doing is some form of barter. I would guess that the Federation is giving security services in exchange for whatever goods that might be provided by the Ferengi. I'm highly skeptical that the Ferengi have much in the way of military. So another good rule of acquisition, number 20, he who dives under the table today lives to profit tomorrow. That doesn't seem like a very, gung-ho, let's go shoot up some people philosophy. So I'm guessing that there is a different form of barter there, but I don't really know what they would be trading. And, if you stop and think about it, trade is happening between individuals, not between countries, right? So it's not that the Federation is trading with the Ferengi government so much as it is private citizens on Earth might be trading with Ferengi. It would make sense then to have a little bit of latinum lying around if you thought that you might want to buy stuff from the Ferengi. So I would venture to guess that most private citizens, you don't need money to use a replicators in your home. You might actually still have some money somewhere that you can use to buy stuff from outside of your federation. So have some latinum laying around just in case something that you want to buy appears on the next Ferengi cargo ship.
So pretty much barter and currency are the only trading options that we have come up with as a society so far.
I hate to say only just because I'm sure in 5 minutes there's something else. But those are the predominant ones. Those are the ones that I'm thinking of.
All right. So let's change topics somewhat and talk about some of the ways that our current society might get closer to that Star Trek ideal, or possibly towards a better society in general. One of the ideas that I've been reading a lot about and gets brought up when talking about the Star Trek society, as well as being an idea that's being discussed and experimented with in some developed countries, is the universal basic income. For those who are unfamiliar with it, why don't you give a basic definition of that idea and how it would be implemented in today's world?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of different variations of the basic income guarantee. Some of them are actually coming from surprising places. So if you're familiar with the economics of a dude named Milton Friedman, who's sort of synonymous with the libertarian movement, he advocated something way back in the 60s called a negative income tax, which looks a lot like a basic income guarantee. But so the way the policy looks generally today, it's typically more of a left-leaning policy, although, again, I'll give some caveats a little bit later. What you would do is you would replace a whole host of social programs, things like unemployment, things like welfare, things like food stamps and housing assistance and whatnot, with a check. And every person, and it should literally be every person. It shouldn't be, just poor people. Bill Gates should get this check too, for some unspecified amount of money per week, per month, something like that. So typically you're going to see numbers, maybe $800 a month, $1,000 a month for every person living in America. And that would replace this whole raft of welfare programs that would, in theory, replace something like Social Security as well. Now, that having been said, this is a very expensive program. I was looking at, there's a new person who just declared his presidency not that long ago, who's advocating for a basic income guarantee, and they did the math, and it's something like $2.4 trillion, which is a lot of money from the federal government when you consider the total government budget right now is about $4 trillion. So you'd be replacing some welfare, you'd be replacing, in hypothetically, some Social Security, but that's sort of the trade-off, is you eliminate the lots of different itty-bitty welfare-type programs, and you replace that with just a check for everybody. As I said, this typically is pushed by people on the left side of the spectrum, but you'd be surprised that there's some people who are on more of the right side of the political spectrum who like this simply because they view the current welfare system as being overly bureaucratic and in many ways sort of infantilizing the people receiving welfare by saying, hey, for example, food stamps, right? We say, hey, you're not smart enough to make decisions, so we're going to give you this money that you can only spend on food. And so it really does liberate people to use these resources in whatever way they see fit. So there's some people who are on the right side of the spectrum who like these policies as well, at least in principle.
And personally, having been on food stamps at one point in my life, not only is it you can't spend this on anything but food, but they also limit the kinds of food you can get. For instance, even at the grocery store, you can't buy heated, pre-prepared food from, say, the deli counter. You have to basically take home ingredients and cook it yourself.
That sucks.
Yeah, it was not fun.
Well, and as an economist, I would view that as another form of taxation. We're telling you that your time must be spent cooking food. Maybe your time, because you're on food stamps, is best served looking for a better job that pays more or working more hours at a second job rather than spending an extra hour a day cooking and cleaning and doing all that goes along with that. Maybe spending an extra 50 cents or an extra dollar to buy pre-cooked food might actually be better for you in the long run. Maybe you just suck at cooking. Like, who knows?
Yeah, I do. Ask my roommate, he'll tell you. If it doesn't go in the microwave, I'm in trouble.
So one of the reasons that I see as promoting the universal income is the fact that productivity continues to increase while wages and the amount of people necessary for particular jobs stays the same or decreases, with artificial intelligence and automation taking over those positions. Is there a point where society would become automated enough that a universal income would become necessary?
So I want to start, you had a bunch of different elements in that question, and so I want to unpack them a little bit. First, I want to start with the idea of productivity gains. And you argued, and I think you're absolutely correct, that we do see rising productivity, and it has been rising for quite some time. But the thing to note about that increase in productivity is that increase in productivity started 150, 200 years ago. And 150 and 200 years ago, people were asking the exact same question. How are we going to cope in a world in which machines are replacing human beings? And somehow for the last 200 years, new jobs have been created that have filled in what machines can't do. So while it's definitely true that productivity is rising, and it's definitely true that automation is replacing some jobs that humans used to do, that doesn't necessarily mean that jobs will be destroyed. On net, jobs will be destroyed. So we know that certain jobs will be destroyed. So an example, we might look at truck drivers. When we see the full-on innovation of self-driving cars hit the roads, we're probably going to see a lot of jobs disappearing as a result of that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that new jobs won't crop up in their place, because every time there's a technological innovation, there's been something else that has come up. Now, I'm not a futurist. I can't really predict what we're going to see in place of that. I would guess, just looking at the truck driving industry, for example, we're probably going to see a decline in cross-country trucking, but an increase in local trucking, simply because AI can probably do a really good job of taking trucks between Cleveland and Cincinnati, but they're probably not going to do quite as good a job, in loading docks and in, little tiny areas with kids and dogs and whatever running around. So there's probably still going to be different roles that humans might take more of an active part in as a result of that. So, one, I don't know if I necessarily think that an increase in productivity will lead to a decline in jobs. The second part, what was the second part of your question? I've been answering this for a while.
So you've basically rejected the premise that this automation we're seeing continue to rise will lead to net unemployment in large numbers. But if you do grant that premise as a hypothetical, is a universal income a good way to help out those who are unemployed simply because there are not enough jobs to go around due to the market forces that I talked about?
Well, I'll be honest, I don't think I need to grant the premise at all to say that I think that universal income may be a better solution to the way that we currently do welfare in most countries. I think that it's probably a lot less heavy-handed. And if we are going to engage in some form of welfare, I think that that one probably makes more sense than most of the other, intricate, you get, X amount of money from this agency and some other amount of money from some other agency. So, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to argue is that I don't know if I needed all the buildup of what if the world looks like this? Do we need universal basic income? I think that if it's a good policy, it would stand on its own merit aside from any productivity changes causing structural changes to the economy that might destroy huge amounts of jobs. My intuition is that if the cost can be kept in check, it's probably a better policy in the long run than the stuff that we're currently doing, simply because a lot of the stuff that we're currently doing has a lot of negative incentive effects if you look at how they're actually administered. A lot of welfare programs, for example, will have income thresholds at which you'll stop receiving money altogether. So you might go from making $20,000 in income with a $10,000 subsidy to making $20,001 with a $0 subsidy. Like, that's just a really bad policy instrument. And if you have a universal basic income, you can eliminate a lot of these weird policy instruments that are going to have big disincentive effects on working.
Speaking of which, let's reverse the question a little bit. I'd say the biggest talking point against a universal basic income that I've heard is that it is a disincentive to work. Have you seen any of the studies on this, and what do you think of this argument?
So I've briefly looked at some of the results of the Finland experiment where they found very little disincentive to work. So one of the silly thought experiments I like to use in my class is I ask my students, to picture yourself as an 8-year-old. And if they gave you the choice between a pony and a unicorn, which would you prefer? And of course, everyone prefers the unicorn. But the problem is that unicorns aren't real. So even though we like this thing, the fact that it's not real means it shouldn't be in the comparison at all. If we're going to look at universal basic income and does it have unemployment effects or disemployment effects, I should say, does it have incentives that are going to induce people to work less? We shouldn't be comparing that to a hypothetical world in which nothing happens. We should be comparing that to the current system that we have where unemployment checks generate disincentive effects, where the ability to easily abuse for say Social Security disability payment stuff, right, that provides huge disincentive effects. I would think that again, this is my intuition. My intuition is that the universal basic income, while it may have disemployment effects, I think they're not going to be as bad as what we currently see in the welfare system between food stamps and unemployment checks and housing allowances and things like that, simply because the way they're given as a lump sum instead of as a proportion that sort of declines in a means-tested format.
Let me tie this back into Star Trek now.
Sure.
So I read an article recently, and I apologize that I didn't send it to you so that we could compare notes on it.
Oh, no.
So the idea that was suggested in this article, called The Economics of Star Trek by Rick Webb, is that the citizens of the Federation have a universal basic income. But it's so high that it is basically transparent, because their budget is so much larger than what anyone would need or even want, given that individuals in the society have agreed not to continually want more. As an example, say their income is something like the equivalent of $2 or $3 million in today's money, which easily covers food, shelter, clothing, entertainment, and any other reasonable want or need that the person may have. Because of this, the average person doesn't even bother thinking about money, since they know they won't ever run out, and so basically they forgot that money exists.
I mean, I'm going to push back a little bit on just the premise of that. like right now, sitting in my living room, $3 million a year of income sounds pretty phenomenal. But if I was accustomed to $3 million a year of income, would I still think that's phenomenal? Or would I think that, I'm just barely getting by on my caviar and filet mignon every night? Like, I need a little bit more. I want better food. I want fancier, clothes. I want better synthahol or whatever, right? So why would I not at that point want more? I think this gets back to the fundamental premise of what is the nature of man. Is the nature of man malleable, or is the nature of man fixed? And if the nature of man is fixed and man is inherently greedy, going back to, again, the 10th rule of acquisition.
The 10th rule of acquisition is greed is eternal.
Then we're never going to get there. I love the rules of acquisition. I just love them.
Yeah, they're a lot of fun.
Is that biased?
My two favorites are...
And as the 34th rule of acquisition states, peace is good for business.
That's the 35th rule.
You're
those,
right.
Yeah.
What's the 34th?
My favorite, though, is
War is good for business. It's easy to get them confused.
That's just profound. Love that one.
You can't
but
free
yeah,
a fish
greed
from
is
water.
universal. Is, if that is the nature of man, then $3 million a year is not going to cut it, dude. I'm going to want more. If that's not true, if we change the nature of man, if it is malleable, then absolutely it could be enough, and I could be happy by that. And so we're really stepping into deep philosophical questions. Can we change humanity at its core, or can't we? And I think that Star Trek requires us to take that leap of faith that once we hit a certain level of society, I think that Picard says that, humanity has grown up or has, gone beyond its infancy or something like that. I forget his exact phrase.
A lot has changed in the past 300 years. People are no longer obsessed with the accumulation of things. We've eliminated hunger, want.
If
the
that
need
happens,
for possessions.
then I think Star Trek
We've grown out of our
or the Star Trek economy is much more feasible. And maybe that's the actual science fiction of it all. Maybe the science fiction is that man has changed, that we are able as a society to become more group looking than inward looking, that we're able to become more of a empathetic as opposed to a selfish beast.
Well, I hope that's the case, although we've seen very little evidence of it so far. And that's where we ended it. Basically, it seems that, according to Dr. Dobra, the question of whether the moneyless society of the Federation is possible is less an economic question and more a philosophical one. I want to thank my guest again. Although he said he doesn't use it very often these days, if you want to follow him on Twitter, you can do so at Matt Dobra. It rhymes with and is spelled like Cobra. And of course, you can follow me at Geektown Podcast, where you'll often find me talking to comic fans and professionals alike. Or, if you'd rather send me a message privately, you can do that by sending an email to me at welcometogeektown, all spelled out, @gmail.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown, or leaving a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2, the number 2 in this case, geektown.com. This month, I want to be sure to shout out my inaugural patrons. Josh Bald, who says, "I'm not only a patron, I'm also a client." And the very first to sign up, Michelle Cruz. Thank you both very much. And if you're not one of those two, please go to patreon.com/welcometogeektown and check out the rewards that just $1 per month can get you. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council to help other people find the show so we can all tell them,
Welcome to Geektown, Population Us.
Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music by Aaron Levitz, logo art by RG Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended.